In the Baltic Sea, the world witnessing a drama unprecedented in modern warfare. The Swedish Navy's Visby-class corvettes, which are as invisible as ghosts to radar and resemble invisible daggers slicing through the sea with their angular designs. And in the sky, accompanying them, the Swedish Air Force's predatory Eagles, the Gripen jets. Their target is what was once one of the Russian Navy's greatest prides, a Project 636.3 Varshavyanka-class submarine, known as the Kilo class in NATO terminology. But this is not a silent cat-and-mouse game in the depths, with sonar pings creating tension, as we see in the movies. There is no tension in this scene, only utter humiliation. This is not a show of force for Russia. It is, in the truest sense of the word, a parade of shame. Because the prey being pursued is not a ghost silently gliding through the depths of the sea. It is a massive metal wreckage, rusted, weary, and defeated, helplessly floundering in tow behind a tugboat, spewing the acrid smoke of a diesel engine on the surface of the water. This was not a hunt, it was a living autopsy. Now, before our very eyes, the most intimate secrets of one of history's most closed and paranoid military structures are being decoded. The surgeon of the operation is Sweden, NATO's newest, most ambitious, and perhaps historically most hostile member towards Russia. When the Russian submarine reached Kattegat on October 16th, Swedish forces took over the operation. However, Sweden's intervention was of a very different nature than the surveillance activities of its previous allies. It was a disproportionate and overwhelming show of force. From the sea, Visby-class corvettes, renowned for their radar-evading capabilities and composite hulls, formed a circle around the submarine. These ships were equipped not only with 57mm Bofors guns and RBS-15 anti-ship missiles, but also with the most modern Saab-made Torpede 47 light torpedoes. The slightest wrong move could have been even more deadly for the submarine. At the same time, the sky was completely covered by the Swedish Air Force's JAS-39 Gripen fighter jets. With their PS-05/A Mark IV radars and Meteor missiles, the Gripens were there not only to deter the submarine, but also any Russian elements that might dare to come to its aid. Although the Swedish military described this operation as a routine mission, the arrogance and confidence underlying this statement had a chilling effect in Moscow. This routine was the new normal in the Baltic, and in this new normal, Sweden was the hunter and Russia was the prey. These moments are not just the story of a faulty Russian submarine. This was the moment when Putin's invincible navy myth, meticulously built over 25 years, sank into the cold waters of the Baltic. The irony behind this scene is as sharp as a Shakespearean tragedy. For years, the Baltic has been a strategic playground for Russia. Since the Cold War years, Russian submarines had always been a source of fear for the West. Thanks to the historic naval base in St. Petersburg and the heavily armed Kaliningrad exclave, wedged between Poland and Lithuania, Moscow had significant power projection capabilities in these waters. These Russian submarines, the subject of Tom Clancy novels, silently waiting in the depths of the ocean with nuclear missiles, were the worst nightmare of Western admirals. Their power came from being undetectable. Their very existence was the greatest threat. The presence of neutral Finland and Sweden granted Russia significant freedom of movement. Today, however, in the harsh new reality of the 21st century, that nightmare has turned into a comedy. But Vladimir Putin's decision on February 24, 2022, to invade Ukraine en masse, created a domino effect that changed this equation fundamentally and forever. This was Putin's biggest strategic own goal of the 21st century. The war he started to push NATO back and away from its borders had the opposite effect. It brought NATO to the broadest and strongest point in its history. With Finland and then Sweden, which abandoned its centuries-old policy of military neutrality, joining NATO, the geopolitical map of the Baltic Sea was redrawn overnight. A simple glance at the map reveals this painful truth in all its starkness. Poland, Germany, Denmark, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Finland, and now Sweden. Russia's St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad ports are now completely encircled by NATO countries like a vice. The Danish Straits, Great Belt, Little Belt, and Öresund, the only exit route for the Russian Baltic fleet to the Atlantic Ocean, are now controlled like a NATO inland waterway. This new strategic reality has turned into a trap that suffocates Russia in its own backyard, reducing its room for maneuver to zero. The effects of this trap began to be felt from the end of September. Russia's hybrid warfare tactics, involving the launch of drones from civilian-looking ships near the capitals of countries such as Denmark and Sweden, had already raised tensions in the region to the highest level. These provocations triggered a serious security alert in the Scandinavian capitals, but they also demonstrated how prepared and determined NATO is to counter these new threats. Now, the hunting down of Novorossiysk in this tense atmosphere became the first and biggest catch of this new geopolitical trap. In the past, a malfunctioning Russian submarine could have quietly returned to its base without causing such a major crisis, but not anymore. Every move is now monitored by integrated NATO radar and sensor networks stretching from Gotland Island to the Estonian coast. Their every step is shadowed by Sweden, the new and confident Russian hunter. The ports of St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad are no longer centers of power projection. They have become isolated targets that NATO can blockade at any moment. So why was Sweden tracking the Russian submarine with disproportionate force? Sweden's pursuit of Novorossiysk in the Baltic waters like a hunting animal is not only a reflection of current geopolitical tensions, but also the latest and most ironic chapter in a historical rivalry dating back hundreds of years, written in blood and steel. This relentless struggle between Russia and Sweden is based on control of the Baltic Sea, or Dominium Maris Baltiti, and this struggle dates back to the birth of modern Russia. In the early 18th century, Peter the Great, Peter I, was searching for a window to open Russia to the west when he found himself facing the Swedish Empire, the superpower of the time. The Great Northern War, which lasted 21 years, changed the fate of these two powers forever. With his victories at Poltava and at sea at the end of the war, Peter broke Sweden's absolute dominance in the Baltic and founded the present-day city of St. Petersburg on the Neva River Delta, once Swedish territory. Thus, the heart of Russia's Baltic fleet, its historic capital, and its window to the west were built upon Sweden's defeat. This historical fact has left a deep and indelible mark on the collective memory of both nations. Every Russian admiral setting sail from St. Petersburg is aware that he is sailing on waters that once belonged to their greatest enemy. And every Swedish officer, when looking east, sees that massive Russian city built upon their lost empire and homeland. Throughout the Cold War, this rivalry continued in a quieter but more insidious way. Although officially neutral, Sweden was always on guard against the Soviet Union's expansionism in the Baltic. The most iconic event of this period is undoubtedly the Whiskey on the Rocks incident of 1981. The S-363, a Soviet Whiskey-class submarine, allegedly carrying nuclear weapons, ran aground near Karlskrona, one of Sweden's most important naval bases. This incident showed the world how seriously the Soviets took Sweden's neutrality, and how they viewed these waters as their own playground. At that time, Sweden was largely helpless in the face of such provocation, beyond diplomatic protests and limited military measures. In the post-Cold War era, and especially with Putin's rise to power, this audacity increased. After the annexation of Crimea in 2014, Russian warplanes repeatedly violated Swedish airspace, even conducting a simulated nuclear attack drill on one occasion. Reports of Russian submarines sighted in the Stockholm archipelago sparked weeks of submarine hunt panic in the country. All these events showed how vulnerable Sweden was on its own against the massive Russian military machine. Stockholm felt humiliated and threatened. However, the scene changed dramatically overnight with Vladimir Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, his biggest strategic mistake of the 21st century. By launching this war to weaken NATO and push it away from its borders, Putin achieved the opposite effect. He brought the alliance to the strongest and most united point in its history. This strategic earthquake created the biggest shockwave in Scandinavia. Finland and Sweden, abandoning their centuries-old policy of military neutrality, joined NATO. This decision changed the geopolitical map of the Baltic Sea forever. Sweden was no longer alone. Every Russian provocation in the Baltic now meant a challenge not only to Sweden, but to all NATO capitals, from Washington to London, Paris to Warsaw. This helpless hunt in Novorossiysk is the first and most tangible fruit of this new reality. The Russian ghosts that roamed Swedish waters with impunity yesterday are now being hunted like prey in those same waters by Swedish hunters equipped with NATO's most modern technology. This is the most concrete, painful, and shameful declaration of how costly the shifting balance of power, historical justice, and strategic error can be. As we mentioned earlier, Sweden was not alone. Although the final act of this shameful drama was played out in the Baltic Sea, under Sweden's iron fist, the roots of the story stretch back weeks earlier, thousands of kilometers west, to the strategic waters of the Atlantic Ocean and the English Channel. It all began on October 9, 2025, off the coast of Brittany, France, right in the heart of one of NATO's most intensive patrol and surveillance networks. That day, a modern Aquitaine-class Frem frigate belonging to the French Navy, on routine patrol in the area, detected an unexpected anomaly on its radars and sensors. A Russian Project 636.3 kilo class submarine, the Novorossiysk, was not underwater, but helplessly floating on the surface of the water. This was the confession of the greatest sin, the most deadly mistake a submarine could make: the complete loss of stealth. For a submarine to surface, especially in NATO's backyard, is like a fighter pilot parachuting into enemy airspace. In that moment, you lose not only your tactical superiority, but all your mystery and honor. NATO Maritime Command did not miss this opportunity and announced the situation to the whole world with photographic evidence, delivering the first diplomatic slap to the Kremlin with the message, "We are watching." This was the first sign that the operation would be not only military, but also an information war. As Novorossiysk began its painful and slow journey under the tow of the Russian tugboat Yakov Grabelsky, an escort of what amounted to a convoy of shame formed in the Atlantic. The relentless pursuit initiated by the French was taken over by a Type 23 frigate belonging to the British Royal Navy as it entered the English Channel. As the convoy moved north, warships from the Belgian and Dutch navies also joined this race of flags. Each ally kept the submarine under constant surveillance within its own area of responsibility, instantly transmitting invaluable acoustic and electronic data to NATO headquarters in Brussels, and then handing the task over to the next ally. It was a perfectly synchronized, multi-layered, and suffocating siege. The most critical moment of the drama unfolded when the convoy reached the Danish Straits, that narrow and strategic gateway to the Baltic Sea. This was much more than a geographical transition. It was the moment Novorossiysk officially entered a NATO lake, a death trap. And waiting at the gates of this trap was its new hunter, Sweden. However, NATO's new Secretary-General Mark Rutte delivered another decisive blow. At a press conference in Brussels, responding to a journalist's question, he summed up the situation with a sarcastic reference to Tom Clancy's famous novel, The Hunt for Red October. This doesn't look much like The Hunt for Red October. It looks more like Operation Find the Nearest Repair Shop.
Its Mediterranean task force was once a mix of surface ships, submarines, and support vessels. Now, in effect, there is hardly any Russian naval presence in the Mediterranean left. There is a lone and broken Russian submarine limping home from patrol. What a change from the 1984 Tom Clancy novel, The Hunt for Red October. Today, it seems more like the hunt for the nearest mechanic.
The laughter that erupted in the room sent shockwaves through Moscow. This single sentence transformed the incident from a military fiasco into a diplomatic humiliation that became a global laughingstock. The image of an invincible, technologically superior Russian navy that Putin had painstakingly built over the years was buried in the cold waters of the Baltic at that moment. This incident will go down in Russian naval history as one of the greatest embarrassments since the Tsushima disaster in 1905 or the sinking of the Kursk in 2000. Novorossiysk's painful and humiliating journey is not a single incident or a series of unfortunate malfunctions, but a vivid and dynamic proof of a strategic checkmate move that the Kremlin brought upon itself, with no turning back. Because the Novorossiysk submarine's humiliating passage along the European coastline and in the Baltic Sea goes far beyond a simple mechanical failure. To understand why this incident is so critical, one must recall the most fundamental and sacred principle of modern submarine warfare: stealth. A submarine's entire existence, all its power and deterrence, rests on its ability to remain invisible in the dark, endless depths of the ocean. Silence is its deadliest shield and sharpest weapon. But a submarine helplessly towed by a tugboat for days on the surface has completely lost its most fundamental advantage, its very soul. This situation has opened the doors to a veritable goldmine of intelligence for NATO intelligence services. Under normal circumstances, Western intelligence agencies would need billions of dollars in resources to partially capture the acoustic signature of a Russian Kilo-class submarine, that unique fingerprint of sound produced by its engine, propeller, auxiliary power units, and even the water flowing through its pipes. This is an extremely risky endeavor that often yields incomplete results. Now, however, Novorossiysk was offering all its secrets to NATO on a silver platter, like a live laboratory experiment, along with the sounds it produced at different speeds, under different sea conditions, and at different engine speeds. Finally, the most sensitive hydrophones on Swedish ships recorded every decibel, every frequency, every vibration emitted by this submarine. This data was instantly uploaded to NATO's massive acoustic libraries and analyzed by artificial intelligence algorithms. What is the result? Not only the B-261 Novorossiysk, but all Project 636.3 class submarines in the Russian Navy can now be detected much more easily in any future operation. The acoustic cloak that made them silent killers, or black holes in the ocean, has been shattered. The Russian bear has been permanently blinded. This is a massive strategic loss that will affect not only today, but the coming decades, and it is irreparable. Now, whenever any Kilo-class submarine ventures into the ocean, it is no longer a foreign threat to NATO sonars, but a noisy, familiar target whose vulnerabilities are well known. So, what exactly was the clinical diagnosis of this systemic collapse that turned a submarine marketed as one of Vladimir Putin's most modern and quietest underwater killers into a helpless, drifting wreck in the middle of the Atlantic? The roots of this disaster run much deeper than a mere mechanical failure, extending to a decades-long decay that has spread like cancer throughout the Russian military-industrial complex and its logistical infrastructure. The clearest evidence of this decay emerged in a shocking report leaked by Russian and Belarusian media, based on information from dissident sources within the Russian security forces. This report documented that the Novorossiysk did not simply experience a simple engine failure, but was literally gasping for breath in the middle of the sea. According to the report, after leaving Syria, the submarine experienced more than 10 critical and catastrophic events in quick succession during its voyage, completely overwhelming the crew's control. First, the navigation system, the brain of the ship, completely failed. Then, the operational software failed. The periscope, its eye, malfunctioned. However, the real nightmare for the crew and the fatal blow that led to the decision to surface came when the fuel system essentially exploded, causing highly flammable diesel fuel to begin leaking directly into the ship's hold, i.e., the crew's living quarters. This was not a simple leak, but an uncontrollable disaster that could turn the ship and its nearly 80 personnel into a massive fireball at any moment. This was not a malfunction, this was a system collapse, and this collapse left the crew with an impossible choice. Either burn silently to death at the bottom of the sea, or surface in full view of NATO and accept utter humiliation. They were forced to choose the latter. However, the real disaster was hidden in a much larger strategic picture than this momentary crisis, and this picture was laid bare in all its nakedness by renowned open-source intelligence (OSINT) analyst H.I. Sutton in his own analysis. According to Sutton, the problem was not just Novorossiysk's rusty pipes or aging gaskets, but the complete paralysis of Russia's entire logistical backbone in the Mediterranean. For years, Russia had been using the port of Tartus in Syria as a forward base, circumventing the Montreux Convention to deploy submarines belonging to the Black Sea Fleet there. However, this strategy collapsed with two fatal blows. The first blow was diplomatic. Turkey's resolute application of the Montreux Convention, based on international law, against Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its closure of the Istanbul and Dardanelles Straits to warships, completely destroyed the military logistical bridge between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. The second blow was technological. Ukraine's daring and innovative naval drones hunted down Russian supply ships and even repair facilities remaining in the Black Sea one by one, crippling Russia's logistical capacity. The combination of these two developments turned Russia's Tartus base in Syria into an island, cut off from the mainland, with its supply and repair capabilities completely destroyed. Therefore, it became impossible to repair the Novorossiysk, which had suffered a serious engine failure in Tartus. Only one option remained: to reach the shipyards in St. Petersburg or Kaliningrad on the Baltic Sea. This meant a humiliating journey of 6,000 kilometers, fraught with danger, and passing entirely through enemy waters. Russia's control and logistical dominance in the Mediterranean had evaporated to such an extent that it had no choice but to risk thousands of kilometers to repair one of its most valuable strategic assets. This was not just a technical failure, but also the most painful admission of decades of strategic arrogance and geopolitical bankruptcy. In sum, it is not just a rusty submarine struggling with technical malfunctions, hunting in the cold and unforgiving waters of the Baltic Sea. It is the great illusion of power that Vladimir Putin has painstakingly built over the past 25 years. It is the pride of the Russian Navy. It is the myth of invincibility that Russian military technology once possessed. This decaying wreck, forced to surface and endure a humiliating journey of thousands of kilometers in tow, is not merely the result of a mechanical failure, but also the inevitable and painful consequence of a deep-rooted strategic blindness, systemic corruption permeating the entire apparatus, and reckless arrogance. This metal coffin has become the most concrete and painful symbol of an empire's dream, drowned before a single torpedo was fired due to its leader's catastrophic strategic errors and a systemic cancer ingrained in the regime's veins. This incident documented the failure of a mindset beyond military equipment and strategies. It has shown that in the modern world, brute force and old-fashioned bluffs stand no chance against integrated technology, united will, and strategic intelligence. Throughout this crisis, roles have been redistributed definitively. NATO is no longer merely a defensive alliance that observes, condemns, or voices concerns. NATO has transformed into a proactive and ruthless mechanism that learns, adapts, and turns even the slightest weakness of its enemy into a strategic advantage. On the other hand, Sweden has awakened from its centuries-long slumber of neutrality, not only standing up to its historic enemy, but also striking at its most vulnerable moment, demonstrating Viking power in the Baltic Sea. Now, Sweden is no longer chasing. Sweden is ruling in its own waters. This passage of shame is not a simple loss of prestige for the Kremlin. It is an irreparable fracture that will fundamentally question all future naval operations, all strategic calculations, and its very presence in the Baltic. Thank you for choosing us.